Our day in Sodom and Gomorrah. If ever the world was bad in regards to moral degradation, one of the most outstanding examples would have to be the account recorded in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 10 is where we'll start. After the flood, in Genesis 10, we have the breakup of Noah's family. In verse 2, we read of the sons of Japheth. In verse 21, we have the lineage of Shem. But in verse 6 is where I want to focus. In this verse, we have the progeny of Ham. Genesis 10 and verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan. And then in verse 7, we have the line of Cush's family. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Raamah, and Sabteka, and the sons of Raamah, Sheba, and Dedan. Then in verses 8 to 10, we have another son born to Cush. And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And in verse 10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now, we frequently hear about Cush and Nimrod, as Nimrod was the one with whom pagan worship began in Babel or Babylon, and has been with the world ever since until the very end, because in Revelation 17 it's the destruction of Babylon. But now I want to go in a slightly different direction. In verse 6 we have, and the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan. Come now to verses 15 to 19. And Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Avidite, and the Zemanite, and the Hamathite, and afterwards were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. And the border of the Canaanites was Sidon, and thou camest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboam, even unto Lasha. Now the progeny of Canaan, being the Jebusites, the Amorites, and the Girgasites, and the Hivites, to name just a few, were nothing but a pain to Israel much later in the settlement of Israel in the Promised Land, Israel being of the lineage of Shem, Ham's brother. But in verse 19, as we have just read, is where we have the first mention of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, at this point, Sodom and Gomorrah were only mentioned as cities. By the time we get to chapter 13 of Genesis, Abraham, then called Abram, had been called out of Canaan to a land that God would show him. He had taken Lot with him. And after some time together on their travels, tensions grew in the camp, and it was time for the family to separate into their own identities. So Genesis 13 and verses 8 to 12, and Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we are brethren, we're all in the one family. Verse 9, is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right, I will go to the left. And in verse 10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou camest unto Zoar. Verse 11, then Lot chose him the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Verse 12, and Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. So here we have a second mention of Sodom and Gomorrah. Apart from the mention that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it sounds like these two cities were very beautiful, just like Eden, garden of the Lord. But in the very next verse, verse 13, we have an added characteristic. Verse 13, But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So in these verses we have a definite explanation of who these people are. Now with that understanding, I just want to go to Genesis chapter 14. There's war in the land. As a result of this war of the kings, Lot was captured and all his goods in verse 12. Abram heard his nephew was in trouble and went to fight for Lot and was successful and brought not only Lot back, but all the goods and the woman and the people in verse 16. But things didn't get any better in Sodom and Gomorrah at all, and by the time we get to Genesis 18, the fruit is fully ripe. It's gone too far. Genesis 18 and verses 1 to 5. Genesis 18 verses 1 to 5. And the Lord appeared unto him, that's Abraham, in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And verse 2, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself towards the ground. And verse 3, and said, My Lord, if now I have found favour in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from my servant. Verse 4, let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort your hearts. After that ye shall pass on. Therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do as thou hast said. Now I want to go right straight to verse 16. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? And in verse 18, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he had spoken of him. And verse 20, and the Lord said, Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. And in verse 22, and the men turned their faces from thence and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And verse 23, and Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? And verse 25, that be far from thee to do after this manner, to stay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked? That be far from thee, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And verse 26, and the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And the rest of the chapter continues as Abraham counts down to just 10. But now we come to chapter 19. This is where we really focus on the lesson in this message. Genesis 19 and verses 1 to 9. And there came 2 angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing the men, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face towards the ground, and he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early, and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night. And in verse 3, he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. Verse 4, but before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And verse 5, and they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And in verse 6, and Lot went out the door to them and shut the door after him. Verse 7, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and you do them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, and therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. I cannot understand at this point, I just break here, I cannot understand at this point how Lot could do that to his 2 daughters. I just don't understand that. But we'll come back to that. Verse 9, and they said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came into sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now we will deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. These same 2 angels that had just visited and dined with Abraham arrived in Sodom, and Lot is the first to meet them at the gate of the city. Now Lot obviously has some principles still from the days of when he was with Abraham, because he's polite, and he politely respects and welcomes them. And then he invites them to his home to stay for the night. But these visitors were happy to sleep in the street. But Lot knew that city, and he did not want those visitors anywhere near the streets overnight. So he pressed the issue and took them into his home and fed them and lodged them. There were others in that city that had spotted these 2 men arrive. Before Lot and his guests turned in for the night, there was a raucous noise outside. There were men right around the house. They were young men and there were old men demanding these 2 visitors to come out onto the street. And their purpose was to defile them sexually. And then the unimaginable happens. Lot offers this debauched, perverted pack of ravening perverts his 2 virgin daughters. How do you comprehend that? But more than that, he offers those virgin girls that they can do what they want with them that seems good in their eyes. I mean, honestly, is anything good going to come from any of these men? Hardly. And one staggers at the morals and the values of Lot. He says he has taken these 2 visitors under his roof for protection. Weren't his daughters, so-called morally clean, as valuable as 2 visitors for one night's accommodation? Surely. But still, those debased, polluted, filthy barbarians push for those 2 visitors. I try to think of worse words that I could use because that's as low as you're going to go. Do we even begin to comprehend what's happening here? Do we even grasp the significance of the level of depravity? Even though the thought of a father throwing his 2 virgin daughters out like an old mat into the hands of deranged, insane and deformed wrecks of humanity, it would have become an angry and a gruesome scene. There's nothing good to say about this situation. It's gross. But the record continues that Lot was saved by the intervention of these 2 visitors. Genesis 19, coming now to verses 10 and 11. But the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. One individual saved by the hands of heaven, but a whole city gone too far. Humanity had come to the end of its depravity. The devil had taken those people as low as God would allow, and now God was going to intervene. Verses 24 to 28, Genesis 19, verses 24 to 28. And then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. In verse 27, and Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and towards all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. So Abraham gets up in the morning and he looks out towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and all he sees is a pool of smoke. Volume 4 of the Testimonies adds to this. Lot chose Sodom for his home because he saw that there were advantages to be gained there from a worldly point of view. But after he had established himself and grown rich in earthly treasure, he was convinced that he had made a mistake in not taking into consideration the moral standing of the community in which he was to make his home. So Lot is torn here. He knows he's made a mistake. The dwellers in Sodom were corrupt. Vile conversation greeted his ears daily, and his righteous soul was vexed by the violence and crime he was powerless to prevent. His children were becoming like these wicked people, for association with them had perverted their morals. Taking all these things into consideration, the worldly riches he had gained seemed small and not worth the price he had paid for them. His family connections were extensive, his children having married among the Sodomites. So obviously we read here, some of his children were already married, but there was 2 girls that hadn't known men, so they were virgins. The Lord's anger was finally kindled against the wicked inhabitants of the city, and angels of God visited Sodom to bring forth Lot, that he should not perish in the overthrow of the city. They bade Lot bring his family, his wife and his sons and daughters who married in the wicked Sodom, and told him to flee from the place. For, said the angels, we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and entreated his children. He repeated the words of the angel, up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. And now we see what effect that this city has had on them. But he seemed unto his sons-in-law as one who mocked. For they had lived so long in Sodom that they had become partakers of the sins of the people, and the daughters were influenced by their husbands to that their father was mad. Wow, what a tragedy. They were mad. They were well off enough where they were. They were rich and had great possessions, and they could not believe it possible that beautiful Sodom, a rich and fertile country, would be destroyed by the wrath of a sin-avenging God. How could a land get so bad? How could it be that humanity would be perverted, and so perverted that God, their very creator, would have to step in and put an abrupt stop to this debauchery? Patriarchs and Prophets brings a little more out in this and describes it clearer. There is nothing more desired among men than riches and leisure, and yet these gave birth to the sins that brought destruction upon the cities of the plain. Their useless, idle life made them a prey to Satan's temptations, and they defaced the image of God and become satanic rather than divine. We start to see here idle life is where the problem lies. It carries on. Idleness is the greatest curse that can fall upon man, for vice and crime follow in its train. It enfeebles the mind, perverts the understanding, and debases the soul. Satan lies in ambush, ready to destroy those who are unguarded, whose leisure gives him opportunity to insinuate himself under some attractive disguise. He is never more successful than when he comes to men in their idle hours. In Sodom there was mirth and revelry, feasting and drunkenness. The vilest and the most brutal passions were unrestrained. The people openly defied God and his law and delighted in the deeds of violence. Stealthily, imperceptibly, an idle and unguarded mind becomes the court of Satan to unravel any godliness in the human mind, and it just gets worse and worse. This would have to be the pits of humanity. The story would have to be the bottom. There could not be any worse depravity than what we've just read. This is the pits, so bad that God stepped in and annihilated the seat of this wickedness. But could it possibly ever get any worse? Could there be a period in history where there was ever anything else just as bad? Well, yes, there is, sadly. Come to Judges 19. Judges 19. In verse 1 of Judges, we have the story of a Levite. Now, note, this is a Levite, a spiritual leader. He has a concubine, so here we have a spiritual leader from the tribe of Levi with a concubine. And she was from the tribe of Benjamin, Judah, one of the strongest tribes in all Israel. Judah was the royal tribe. And in verse 2, she plays the harlot against this Levite and goes to live with her father for about 4 months. In verse 3, her rightful owner, now called a husband, goes to get her in a friendly manner to bring her back home. In verses 3 to 9 is the reception. He arrived at the concubine's father, very well received and well cared for. In verse 10, the Levite and his concubine with the 2 asses head towards home, and they're going via Jebus, arriving late in the day. A stranger, a servant, offers them a place to stay, but they refused and went to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin, an honourable tribe of the Hebrews. As they were needing accommodation, they waited until they were invited to someone's place. An old man coming back from working in his field met them on the street, and he told them, "Don't lodge in the street," in verse 20. And in verse 21, that old man took them into his own house. He fed the asses, he washed their feet, he ate and he drank with them. And from here on, we see pretty much the same scene as in Sodom on that fateful night. Judges 19, verses 22 to 28. Now, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, beset the house round about, and beat at the door, and spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring forth the man that came to thine house, that we may know him." 23, and the man, the master of the house, went out unto them and said to them, "Nay, my brethren, no, I pray you, do not so wickedly, seeing that this man has come into my house. Do not this folly." Verse 24, "Behold, here is my daughter, a maiden, and his concubine." And this man seems to have the same morals as what Lot did, a maiden. But it says, "Them will I bring out now, and humble ye them, and do with them what seemeth good unto you, but unto this man do not so vile a thing." Verse 25, "But the men would not hearken to him, so the man took his concubine or his wife and brought her forth to them, and they knew her and abused her all the night until the morning, and when the day began to spring, they let her go. Then came the woman in the dawning of the day and fell down at the door of the man's house to where her lord was till it was light. And her lord rose up in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way. And behold, this woman, his concubine, was fallen down at the door of the house, and her hands were upon the threshold. And he said unto her, Up, let us be going. But none answered. And then the man took her upon an ass, and the man rose up and gat him out of the place. Now let's just go over some facts. This man is a Levite in verse 1. He was going to the house of the Lord in verse 18. He is living in the promised land of Israel. After a separation with his wife or concubine, he goes to Bethlehem, Judah to pick her up. And they're on their way home, supposedly going by the house of the Lord, and they lodge at the kindness of another man, an older man. And then the history of Lot is repeated. The sons of Belial pound on the door and demand this new visitor. But the old man offers his maiden and the man's concubine instead, and the concubine is thrown out to this debauched, mentally deranged rabble. And this is where it is slightly different to Lot's daughter's case. No angels came to rescue in this case. It's fully played out. They do take this poor woman and they abuse her all night. The following morning, after the whole nights of abuse, they ditch her. She makes her way back to the door of her Lord. I would say hardly worth the title. He comes out in the morning and goes on his way, orders her up, but there's no response. Friends, she's dead. The abuse was so severe that they literally took the life out of that girl. But it doesn't end there. In verses 29 and 30, Judges 19, 29 and 30, and when he was come to his house, he took a knife and laid hold on his concubine and divided her together with her bones into 12 pieces and sent her into all the coasts of Israel. And verse 30, and so it was that all that saw it said, there was no such deed done, nor seen from that day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider of it, take advice, and speak your minds. And in chapters 20 and 21 is given to the consequences of this terrible action of this brutal rape and murder. The Levite seems to be somewhat concerned about his concubine after he had basically thrown her out to the devouring wolves. God didn't physically come and visit Gibeah with his wrath, but Israel handled it in their own way. And because of this heinous sin which happened in Benjamin, the count that I had, there was 85,160 people were killed, and it just about destroyed the whole tribe of Benjamin. And again I ask, can we even begin to realize the depths of this depravity? How can mankind go so low into such lewdness? I want to leave the history of both these cases at this point. The point I'm really trying to emphasize here is the degradation and the depravity that humanity will go down to, that society will just allow it to develop into what it ends up as. That many people get hurt and defiled, and little is done or said about it until God has to step in and intervene before man totally destroys himself, or the devil does it for him. How do we get so low, friends? Well, humanity is humanity. Depraved humanity doesn't change much over millennia. It doesn't end with Sodom and Gomorrah and Gibeah, I'm afraid. Coming up to the New Testament, we have another record of it. In Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, I know this is a block of text, but this is right up here in Romans. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. And in verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. Verse 20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, and became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. And now we start getting to our subject in verse 23, and change the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. In other words, idolatry. Verse 24, wherefore God gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up to vile affections, for even their woman did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one towards another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error which was meet. Verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. Verse 31, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So it comes right through into the New Testament. And again I say, humanity is humanity. Depraved humanity is depraved humanity. It doesn't change much, even over millennia. And you know, a startling thought comes to mind at this point. Could it be at all possible that there could be any trace of this in our day, just before the coming of the Lord? We have a record of old Israel fell into severe immorality just before entering the promised land while at Shittim. The Midianite woman came and stole into the Israelite camp, and adultery and fornication became rampant. So much so that an awful plague broke out and 24,000 lost their lives. You can read the full story in Numbers 25. So in laying this foundation, we come to the climax of our message. Could it be a possibility that as modern spiritual Israel prepares to go to the promised land, that there could be any debauchery of any similarity of any kind in our day? I mean, in our advanced technological and enlightened world, could it be that at all possible that the devil has degraded our present day humanity to such a degree as at the time of Lot, or at the time of the Judges, or at the time of Romans? Well, brace yourself for some staggering figures of our modern day. We have this quote from Radio New Zealand, January the 15th, 2021. Gay, lesbian or bisexual people are more than twice as likely to suffer from sexual violence or family harm than their heterosexual counterparts. The Ministry of Justice figures from the Crime and Victims Support Survey shows gay, lesbian or bisexual people are more likely to experience crime, but also less likely to report it. On average, 16% of New Zealanders are likely to experience intimate partner violence at some point in their life, while 24% will experience sexual violence. Lesbian or gay people are more than twice as likely to have experienced that kind of violence, and bisexual adults are almost 3 times as likely to suffer from sexual violence as the average New Zealander. Tim Hampton, Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Justice, said the survey has put a concrete number on the harm caused to those communities. These groups are 50% more likely to become victims of crime, and more concerningly, the survey showed that 2/3 of bisexual adults had been victims of sexual violence at some stage in their life. That compares to 1/4 of all New Zealanders and 52% of the gay or lesbian adults. Hampton said the survey helps officials to understand what sort of support these community needs. He said crime has a huge financial cost, which is why it is so important to improve the outcomes for these communities. It's into the billions of dollars every year that just family violence and sexual violence alone is costing the economy and costing the people here. That's taxpayers' dollars. From the financial side, the need for investment is there, and hence the $200 million investment the government put in the budget. Another report in March the 10th, 2021, nearly 1 in every 4 New Zealand women between the ages of 15 and 49 have experienced domestic violence. The figures released by the World Health Organization, or WHO, show 23% of women are subjected to physical or sexual violence by their partner. Nearly 1 in 3 women worldwide is subjected to physical or sexual violence during her lifetime, pervasive criminal behaviour that has increased during the pandemic. The WHO said on Tuesday, boys should be taught in school about the need for mutual respect in relationships and mutual consent in sex, WHO officials said. Now just hold on that sentence, notice that, we'll come back to that. Boys should be taught in school about the need for mutual respect in relationship and mutual consent in sex. Just remember that, we'll carry on. Violence against women is endemic in every country and culture, causing harm to millions of women and their families, and has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Too much idle time. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said, some 31% of women aged 15 to 49, or up to 852 million women, have experienced physical or sexual violence, the WHO said in what it called the largest ever such study, encompassing national data and surveys from 2000 to 2018, that's 18 years. A husband or intimate partner is the most common perpetrator, and a disproportionate number of victims are in the poorest countries, it said. True figures are likely far higher due to underreporting of sexual abuse, a heavily stigmatised crime. These numbers are very shocking and really a sort of a wake-up call for governments to be doing much more to prevent this violence, reported author Claudia Garcia Moreno. 1 in 4 adolescent girls aged 15 to 19 who have had a relationship have been subjected to either physical or sexual violence, Garcia Moreno said. This is a very important and formative time in life, and we know that the impacts of this violence can be long-lasting and can affect the physical and mental health and lead to unwanted pregnancies and other complications, she said. In another report we have in March the 31st, 2021, we have this report. About 500 people have gathered on Courtenay Place in Wellington to rally against sexual violence in the city. The rally, organised by the Wellington Alliance Against Sexual Violence, is calling on the local council, government and Hospitality New Zealand to commit to changing the culture of Wellington, which the Alliance says permits and perpetrates sexual violence. It wants a revamp of the central city, a strategy to prevent violence that hospitality staff can implement, and more funding for sexual violence prevention organisations. Marama Davidson promised to do what she could as a minister and MP. I will support and do everything in my power to start to move our country towards that beautiful vision. Towards a vision that holds sacred the safety of every single person, the safety of every single woman, the safety of every disabled woman, the safety of every Maori woman, the safety of every Pacifica woman, the safety of every trans woman. Maddie Rowe, a former hospitality worker in the city, resigned after being sexually harassed at work and said that more training of workers would help. I'm talking sexual violence prevention and a bystander intervention training for every single member of the hospitality industry. Here are some of the photos that were taken at this 500-strong rally. We don't have a report of a gang of homosexuals knocking on doors of our modern-day homes wanting some new male visitor to be dragged out to defile and destroy them, but we're not far from it. In a new publication called Navigating the Storms by Ron Woolsey, his new magazine book is about sexuality, identity and love. He's come out of this confused gender lifestyle some years ago and has helped many people who struggle with this same gender phobia when they have come unstuck and wanted to come back to their biological gender. In regards to the subject we talk about, he makes an interesting reference that is staggering to read, and this is from his book, Navigating the Storm, page 9. No one is naturally prepared to successfully travel life's journey without being instructed and well trained. The same holds true for the journey of life involving sexuality, identity, and love. He goes on, makes an interesting statement. One must be aware that there are many would-be instructors that are all too willing and anxious to give sexual instruction to the innocent and the untrained young mind. He carries on and says, it is therefore quite necessary to determine the motive of the would-be instructor that one chooses to trust his or her innocence and naivety. Can we just please realize who should be training the children? And that's the parents. That's the best instructors. He goes on and says, the world of instructors is filled with mischief and those defiant against our Creator God, molesters, pedophiles, adulterers, and other predators who are not really interested in the well-being of the one subject to their instruction. Children, for example, are being taught from as early as preschool that homosexuality is acceptable alternative identity and behaviour. They are being taught how to sexually stimulate themselves and to experiment with other children. Now I say, just hang on a minute, something's not stacking up here. I don't know whether you've picked it up or not, but we just read a little while back that I emphasised that sentence from a national radio broadcast on March the 10th, that the World Health Organization says boys should be taught in school about the need for mutual respect in relationships and mutual consent in sex. Now we read here in this book, Navigating the Storms of Contemporary Sexuality, Identity and Love, on page 9, that children, for example, are being taught from as early as preschool that homosexuality is an acceptable alternative identity and behaviour. They're being taught how to sexually stimulate themselves and to experiment with other children. Friends, are these little ones going to know what mutual respect and mutual consent and sex is all about when they're taught at such a young age to stimulate themselves and help themselves to their mates? Horrible thought. Horrible to say these words, but it's coming. There won't be an age of consent. They won't know what that means. They'll just interfere with others, even if it's against the other's will, because to them it'll be normal behaviour. That is what they have been taught to do, and they'll be overstimulated. The writing is on the wall. And as they get older, we will only see the results of their training. And I tell you, the same writing that was on the wall in Daniel's day will be written on the wall of our legislative halls in our cities in our day. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Friends, we don't have the gangs of homosexuals knocking on the doors of our modern day homes, wanting some new male visitor to be dragged out to defile and destroy them. But give these children a few years and we could well be witnessing with our very own eyes. It'll be normal to them. They're taught to do it. And you know, I've often wondered so often, why are the people of our generation so mixed up that they don't even know what gender they are, or how to behave as men and women? And as I see and as I read more, such as we've just reviewed here, I start to realise that so many homes and schools and communities and governments are so messed up. These confused people have become influenced by the distorted teachings in their tender growing years. And we're seeing the results. So many of these poor children are brought into the world and abused from the beginning. Some even up into their teens. These souls are so confused they haven't been able to live in the happiness of young innocence. and it screws up their minds, and some are attracted to those of their own gender because of it. Deep down they want to be free of it, but they feel they can't go to anyone as they may be an abuser as well, and they don't have any trust. So they struggle on, and many to fall into deep depression and even suicide. And that may be only one reason, yes. But abuse in the early years of whatever nature it is screws those young minds up, and given the amount of immorality online to feed that young disturbed mind, is it any wonder we see what we see today? Now we as Seventh-day Adventist people know where this is going to end up, but what a horrific and entangled path to get to the end. So I want to finish off with some statistics that are disturbing. These statistics as to the morals of our current day world that may turn the stomach. Now, Navigating the Storms, Ron Woolsey's book, again on page 12, according to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, in 2019, men account for the most cases of syphilis, that's 48%, with the vast majority of those cases occurring among men who have had sex with men. Page 13 in Ron's book, this comes out, according to a 2010 CDC data analysis, the rate of primary and secondary syphilis among men who have sex with men is more than 46 times that of other men and more than 71 times of that of women. Promiscuity is the main factor in these other sexually transmitted diseases. Point 1. Despite knowing the AIDS risk, many or most homosexuals repeatedly and pathologically continue to indulge in unsafe sex practices. Secondly, homosexuals represent the highest number of STD cases. Thirdly, more than 1/3 of homosexual men and women are substance users. 4, 40% of homosexual adolescents report suicidal histories. 5, homosexuals are more likely than heterosexuals to have mental health concerns such as eating disorders, personality disorders, paranoia, depression and anxiety. 6, homosexual relationships are statistically recognised to be more violent than heterosexual relationships. And point 7, there is significantly greater medical, psychological and relational pathology in the homosexual population than the general population. Overall, many of these problematic behaviours and psychological dysfunctions are experienced among homosexuals at about 3 times the prevalence found in the general population and sometimes much more. No other group of comparable size in society experiences such intense and widespread pathology. Ron carries on in his book on page 13, and it says, considering again the counsel of our Creator, he says in Exodus chapter 15 verse 26, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Now, let's make an application to this. If 2 young people accept this counsel and choose to abstain from all sexual intimacy until they are united in holy matrimony, and if they remain faithful to each other for life in accordance to their marriage vows, what is the likelihood that either of them would ever contract a sexually transmitted disease? And most probably never. And all what we've just been looking at in this whole thing, do we ever hear anything in our day about total abstinence until marriage? No, we don't, unfortunately. That's God's way. But we don't hear anything about total abstinence. How have we, as a Protestant nation of such high values and morals, come to this degraded mess of low morals and values? How have we got there? And most of us of a mature age have seen the moral decline in our society since our childhood, say in the 60s and 70s, even up into the 80s and even the 90s. It has been so rapid, even in state identities as governments that have taken these moral principles based on God's word and have polluted the land with thy whoredoms and with thy wickedness, Jeremiah 3:2. And again, I say we as a people know where the end results will end up. And here is the reason why. There is nothing new under the sun. In Ezekiel chapter 23 and verse 30, I will do these things unto thee because thou hast gone a whoring after the heathen and because thou art polluted with their idols. Well, here are some more facts that are spiritually, mentally, and socially and physically disturbing. I'm not saying this is the only cause of such a confused condition, but I am saying it opens the floodgates for it to happen and it feeds it. So here are some statistics that are available on the web. Are you ready for these stats? How much porn is accessible online? The amount of pornographic material on the web is staggering. As introductory economics, search engines and other online data repositories tell us, the market for such material is just as large. Now, every second, that's now, 28,258 users are watching pornography on the net. Every second, $3,075, which works out to $4,374 New Zealand, is spent on pornography on the internet. That's every second. Every second, 372 people are typing the words adult into a search engine. That's every second. Now, every day, 37 pornographic videos are created just in the USA. 2.5 billion emails containing porn are sent or received. 68 million search queries related to pornography are generated, and 116,000 queries related to child pornography are received. This is every day. Now, a lot of this is actually achievable to be able to view it, but there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes that you don't see. And all these figures, now bear in mind that the total population of the US is about 330 million. Out of that, about 200,000 Americans are classified as porn addicts. 40 million American people visit porn sites. 35% of all internet downloads are related to pornography. 34% of internet users have experienced unwanted exposure to pornographic content through ads, pop-up ads, and misdirected links or emails, and 1/3 of porn viewers are women. Wow. So how does internet porn use hurt teens? It increases the odds of teenage pregnancies. Teenagers with frequent exposure to sexual content on TV have a substantially greater likelihood of teen pregnancy, and the likelihood of teen pregnancy doubles when the quantity of sexual content exposure within the viewing episodes is high. It hinders sexual development. Pornography viewing by teens disorients them during the developmental phase when they have to learn how to handle their sexuality and when they're most vulnerable to uncertainty and doubt about their sexual beliefs and moral values. So they're being exposed to it before they're ready for it. It raises the risk of depression. A significant relationship also exists among teens between frequent pornography use and feelings of loneliness, including major depression. It creates distorted expectations which hinders healthy sexual development. Adolescents exposed to high levels of pornography have lower levels of sexual self-esteem. Keeping the conversation going with your child about the effects of pornography is essential to heading off issues like depression and low self-esteem. So what about family marriage pornography stats? According to National Coalition for the Protection of Children and Families 2010, 47% of families in the US reported that pornography is a problem in their home. 47%. Pornography use increases the marital infidelity or unfaithfulness rate by more than 300%. 40% of people identified as sex addicts lose their spouses, 58% suffer considerable financial loss, and about 33% lose their jobs. 68% of divorce cases involve one party meeting a new paramour or an illicit lover over the internet, while 56% involve one party having obsessive interests in pornographic websites. The cost of pornography to society. The societal costs of pornography are staggering. The financial cost to business productivity in the USA alone is estimated at $16.9 billion annually. But the human toll, particularly among our youth and in our families, is far greater. According to Patrick Fagan, PhD, psychologist and former Deputy Assistant Health and Human Services Secretary, says this: two recent reports, one by the American Psychological Association on hypersexualized girls and the other by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy on the pornographic content of phone texting among teenagers, make clear that the digital revolution is being used by the younger children to dismantle the barriers that channel sexuality into family life. Wow. Porn hurts adults, hurts children, it hurts couples and families and society. These reports go on to say, among adolescents, pornography hinders the development of a healthy sexuality, and among adults, it distorts sexual attitudes and social realities. In families, pornography use leads to marital dissatisfaction, infidelity, separation, and divorce. Now, what about cost of pornography in the workplace? In February 2010, the number of people using a work computer to visit sexually oriented websites was as high as 28%, according to research conducted by the Nelson Company. The average visit to a porn site from a work computer is about 13 minutes, and during the month, the average worker was estimated to spend 1 hour and 38 minutes on such porn sites. Whoa. But what about church sites or church circles? Statistics on pornography in church circles. 1 in 5 youth pastors and 1 in 7 senior pastors use porn on a regular basis and currently struggling. That's more than 500,000 USA church leaders. 43% of senior church pastors and youth pastors say they have struggled with pornography in the past. And again, these figures most probably aren't anything near like what's happening, but it's obviously held under. These are the figures that are exposed. 64% of Christian men and 15% of Christian women say they watch porn at least once a month, but only 7% of pastors report their church has a ministry program for those struggling with pornography. Wow, it's a bit disproportionate. Teen and pornography statistics. 51% of male students and 31% of female students first viewed porn before their teenage years. The first exposure to porn among men is 12 years of age on average, and 71% of teens hide online behaviour from their parents. Tragic. The second website that we've looked at reveals that 79% of porn performers have used marijuana and 50% have used ecstasy. Friends, is it any wonder with all these statistics that we have the gender mess we're experiencing? Realise also that these figures are only what is revealed. Much more would be going on that is not revealed. With such drug use, they're not even in their right mind. Is it any wonder we see this moral decay in our society today? Will it be long before we see and witness gangs of men banging on doors to drag out a new male visitor in town, or if need be, to take a pure virgin daughter and abuse her all night? Heaven forbid. But wouldn't we have said, heaven forbid, what happened in Judges? It did reach heaven forbid in Sodom and Gomorrah. And it will get to heaven forbid in our day as well. And I say that with confidence. It will get to that stage. How can I be so confident? Well, in Luke chapter 17, verses 28 to 30, we have these words, likewise as it was in the days of Lot. They did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, and they builded. That was in the time of Lot. But also in the time of Lot, when men came to visit, they would bang on the doors, young and old, and want those visitors dragged out. That's what was also happening in the days of Lot. But it goes on here, it says, but the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from the heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Oh, we say, it'll never happen to us. But be careful, friends, be careful, because 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 brings this out, your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. And just remember our state in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Left to our own devising, we will inevitably go down the wrong path. Much more could be said, but the best thing that can be said as we wrap this up is we turn to Philippians chapter 4 and verses 8 and 9. Finally, brethren, this is the counsel that can be for you and I. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of a good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. And in verse 9, those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, and do, and the God of peace shall be with you. I mean, in all this research that we've looked at, and we finished with just one verse, is there any hope in it? Yes, absolutely there is hope. If we look at Exodus 15:26, where God says if we will obey Him, none of these diseases will come upon us. God's way, friends, God's way is to live a pure life. Don't let sex overrule the life. Stand on God's principles. Abstain right through until marriage and have that beautiful relationship, one man with one woman, and none of these diseases will come upon us. Keep away from the porn. Find the mind to be active and not idle. May we think on heavenly things. May we be constructive, because heaven's a beautiful place and hell is going to be very short-lived. So I just encourage each and every one of you, take stock of your morals, where you stand and the values that you hold. Turn to God's Word. Find the beautiful truths as we've just read here in Philippians 4, 8 and 9. Read the words. Those things which you've both learned and received and heard and seen in me, and do, and the God of peace shall be with you. And I would want that for every single one of you. God bless you. Keep strong. Heaven's worth it.